Morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Look, my name is David Huxley from iCare's mobile engagement team, and welcome to the webinar today, which we're discussing cross-border arrangements for workers' compensation. I'm coming to you from the far north coast of New South Wales, where I live, and I'm on Bundjalung country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, people, and ancestors of this country where I live, where I'm based, and pay my respects to the traditional custodians on the various lands on which we all work today. Just start off with a little bit of housekeeping right now. Everyone's camera and microphone are disabled, so there should be no interruptions there. And normally we will just maybe pause on the chat box until the end of the session if we could. Just hold your thoughts and feedback. We'll open that up at the end. Get any comments or questions as well. Now, look, with regards to questions today, we had almost 1,000 registrations, which is fantastic. Obviously a lot of interest, but we can't get to everyone's questions. So what we've done is we're actually going to cover off on as much of that content and much of those questions as possible that were raised through the registration process during the actual presentation. And then at the end, for those who want to hang around, we'll answer do a bit of Q&A as well. We'll get people to pop some questions in the chat. Look, the final bit of housekeeping is that the session is being recorded. So we are recording this and will be made available on our webpage in a couple of weeks' time, sort of 2 to 3 weeks' time, and you'll actually get an email there advising you when that is ready to go. So look, today's webinar is the second in a series during which we're partnering with Turks Legal to provide some clarity around what can be a pretty complicated area. And today we're talking about how to treat workers that either work interstate or maybe cross state or territory boundaries. And look, on that note, it's time to introduce my special guests and subject matter experts. We have both Sean and Shiraz from Turks. Sean and Shiraz, why don't you just quickly introduce yourselves or introduce each other and tell us a little bit about yourselves before we get stuck into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sean Patterson here. I'm a partner at Turks Legal. I've been with the firm for a good 8 years now, and I've got my colleague here, Shiraz, with me.
Morning, everyone. I'm Shiraz. I'm a senior associate here, and I've been at Turks for 4 years now.
Very good, guys. Well, what I thought I might do is just to set the scene for today's session, is sort of cover off probably what was the most common question that we received, and we did receive this through the registration, for this event, and that is there only one workers' compensation scheme, in Australia? Would I need another policy if I try? Why would I need another policy if my workers were interstate? That type of thing. Well, as you can see from what I've just shared on the screen there, you can see the map of Australia. And look, each state and each territory in this country has its own legislation and therefore its own scheme. And this can make things pretty complicated. And just to run through it quickly, you can see the zones in pink, the 4 states and territories there. They're your what's known as your risk-insured states and territories, and those schemes are more like your traditional sort of privately underwritten sort of insurance schemes. Queensland is the only 100% sort of government-managed scheme and the legislation there, whereas the blue states, you can see we have South Australia, Victoria, and we have New South Wales as well. These are known as the fund-managed states, and again, we do have government authorities overseeing the schemes. So third parties will actually tender for various services, for claims management and the like in these states, especially New South Wales. And look, in this state of New South Wales, we have 3 key organisations which can get a little bit confusing for some people. We have the State Insurance Regulatory Authority, SIRA, who regulates the workers' comp scheme, as well as other schemes such as CTP, motor accidents. We have SafeWork New South Wales, who are the work health and safety regulator, and then we have us, iCare, who administers the workers' compensation scheme on behalf of the others. So, look, just wanted to give you a little bit of background, just to set the scene, just to show that it is complicated. Every state and territory has its own legislation and its own bodies sort of running the schemes. And look, before I hand over to Sean, actually, guys, what I want to say is I've got a mate locally up here on the North Coast who heard about this webinar that we're holding here, and he approached me to say, to ask you guys what to do, because he's not sure what to do. And I'll just read you through the details he provided me. So his name's Bob, and he operates up here in the northern New South Wales, really right near the Queensland border. And he has a policy in New South Wales workers' compensation scheme. 3 full-time staff, 3 full-time carpenters, and he's actually secured a job, guys, across the border, a construction job in Queensland. Expected to take 4, maybe up to 6 months. But that's all, just a sort of temporary arrangement. Doesn't have a Queensland policy at this point in time. And while he's in Queensland, he's probably going to employ a couple more sort of workers to complete the job, make sure he gets it done on time. So really, what he wanted me to do is ask you guys, Sean, Shiraz, and one of you can answer that throughout the course of the session. What should he be doing? So we'll just keep that in mind, and we'll sort of answer that question as the session goes on, because it is a pretty sort of common scenario here. So look, on that note, I might hand over to Sean to cover off on what we're talking about today.
Great. We'll come back to Bob the Builder later in the presentation, Hux's friend. So what are we covering today? Employer obligations when it comes to cross-border arrangements, state of connection, so the relevant legal tests that will go into that, temporary arrangements that are made often with companies, and case law examples as well, and hypotheticals, which we'll go through as part of the presentation as well.
Cool. All right, so moving on. So you as an employer, obviously you're required to maintain a policy that covers workers employed in New South Wales. If one of your employees, if their state of connection is New South Wales, they have to be insured in accordance with Section 155 of the 1987 Act. But there is cross-border legislation which determines in which jurisdiction employers are to obtain coverage for their employees. And believe it or not, the intention of that scheme was to simplify things and to reduce the burden on employers, but obviously it can be a little bit confusing. Under the New South Wales Act, only compensation is only payable where a worker's employment is connected to New South Wales. There are, of course, significant penalties if someone doesn't have coverage for their workers in New South Wales. So we move along. Every state and territory, as Hux has touched on, they've got complementary legislation which covers workers that might travel interstate or work interstate periodically. And again, workers are only required to be insured in the state to which their employment is connected, not necessarily where they work or where they're based, but to which their employment is connected. And we've taken that straight from the parliamentary reading. The intention of the amendments was to eliminate the need for employers to obtain workers' comp coverage for a worker in more than one jurisdiction. So the intention was to reduce the burden on employers, but obviously it raises the question, what is someone's state of connection?
So state of connections dealt with under Section 98A of the 1987 Act. And it says that compensation's only payable under the 1987 Act, so that's the New South Wales Act, in respect of employment connected to New South Wales. So it's important to note that an injury that happens outside of New South Wales might still be covered under the New South Wales legislation. So you might be injured in Queensland, but it might still be covered under the New South Wales legislation, which we'll get to. And similarly, it applies to an injury in New South Wales. It might be covered by another state's act. So you might get injured in New South Wales, but it might be or the relevant scheme that looks after that injury could be Queensland or WA, depending on the circumstances. The legislation sets out a cascading series of tests to determine which act covers an injury and where the premium should be paid. So you'll start at test A and then you'll flow all the way down to test E to determine which state or what the state of connection is for that particular worker. So yeah, as I said, if test A doesn't establish a connection with a particular state or territory, you'll move on to test B. Then you move on to test C, then eventually you'll find yourself at test D, where there's eventually going to be an answer to your question. The test should be revisited if a worker's employment circumstances change, which we'll get to shortly as well.
All right, so test A covers off the majority of claims, not always, but it's workers' usual place of work. So the state or territory in which they usually work for that employment. It can be a little bit complex because usual means habitual or customary or in a regular manner. It's not a mathematical exercise of apportioning the time that they spend in a particular state or territory. So they could spend the majority of their time in New South Wales, but they do, in a regular manner, have to go to Queensland or Victoria, or whatever the case may be. Usual means where they spend all of their time. So if they do usually have to travel interstate, this test may not establish the state of connection, but it's the first one we look at. So relevant considerations include their proposed future working arrangements. So if it's agreed this person will, going forward, work in New South Wales, or this person going forward will be based and work exclusively in Queensland, that's how we sort of establish the usual place of work. We also look at the terms of the contract. Is this specified? And one thing that we'll get into in a little bit more detail later is temporary working arrangements for periods of less than 6 months. They're not necessarily regarded as a usual place of work. So if we go on to the next slide, this was a case. Sorry, there we go. When we're considering a worker's history, we look at the 12-month period that commenced prior to the policy period, and we look at their future intentions by looking at what is intended for the next 12 months going forward. So a worker who usually works in New South Wales is required to be covered by New South Wales policy, and that's regardless of where their employer is actually based. It's where they usually work. It is important to note that we look at the worker's employment with this employer, not their general work history. And short periods of employment, they're not necessarily going to be considered temporary arrangements. So again, we'll touch on that a little bit later, but if someone's employed short term, they're going to be exclusively based in New South Wales, they should be insured in New South Wales. So this is a case, it involved a forestry worker, similar circumstances to Bob the Builder, but not quite bang on. It involved a forestry worker. She predominantly worked in New South Wales, but she did regularly go to Queensland to do forestry work, and she sustained an injury. And Roche, the deputy president, he basically set out that the term usually, it's not a mathematical exercise. It's not necessary to apportion the time spent and where they spend the majority of their time, the place or places where they were expressly or by necessary implication contracted to work. So in this matter, she was expected and regularly required to go to Queensland for work. So test A did not set out where her state of connection was. So we moved on to test B. As we touched on as well, if a contract itself is short term, so it's less than 6 months, then you can't consider that a temporary arrangement. So moving on to the next one.
Yep. So if you can't establish test A, so for example, you've got a worker, as in that case previously, that works both between New South Wales and Queensland. It might be a 70-30 split between New South Wales and Queensland, but they nonetheless usually work across both states. You move on to test B. So test B is if there's no single state or territory identified in test A, as I said, then the state or territory in which the worker is usually based for that employment. If the worker usually works in more than one state or territory for employer, then we look at the worker's subjective employment circumstances rather than the employer's business. So you're looking at that specific injured worker and their employment circumstances. We've got some considerations there that give rise to this test B, and it's if a worker is provided a place, they're expected to operate by the employer, the location where they receive instructions or directions, where they collect the materials for their employment. That might be the vehicle that they use if they're a trucker, or any other material that they might collect as part of their duties. Where the employee reports or administrative issues, so that could be, HR considerations. We'll have a couple of examples on the next slide here. So these are just hypotheticals to give some context to test B. So the first one there is a worker's contract, requires them to travel between Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. So they're across 3 states. And they receive instructions from depots in each jurisdiction when traveling, giving them further instructions. In that instance, test B wouldn't be able to be determined. So we'll move on to test C, which we'll get to soon. But I'll give another, sorry, just go back there, Hux. I'll give another hypothetical where test B would be satisfied. So we've got Jenny, who's a sales representative, and she's required to attend a warehouse in New South Wales to collect her products and then distribute them to various outlets in New South Wales and ACT. And she used the vehicle supplied by her employer, which she garages at a home in New South Wales. Her immediate manager is located in the ACT office, but Jenny sends all written correspondence to her manager via fax located at a home in New South Wales. Jenny completes all her necessary documentation and carries out all other administrative tasks in New South Wales. In this instance, it'll be likely we found that Jenny's usually based in New South Wales. I say this is while her immediate manager's in the ACT office. She collects her products in New South Wales, her accommodations in New South Wales, and she completes all her administrative duties in New South Wales, even if she works across both the New South Wales and ACT border. So in that instance, test B would be satisfied.
I'll just add, Sean, we're getting a few questions in the chat. I'm just going to let people know that questions that come up now might get lost towards the end of the session. So just hold your questions if you don't mind till the formal Q&A. Then we can sort of monitor those questions and respond as they come in, because people putting questions now might get lost as they run up the screen throughout the session. So yeah, just wanted to let everyone know that. And everyone will be getting a copy of the slides as well as some other useful resources to help us with this sort of complicated topic. So, sorry, Sean, back to yourself or Sharon.
All good. So just touching again on the case law of Martin and RJ Hibbins, which are, as mentioned earlier, presidential decision from the now late Deputy President Roach. He kind of just reiterated the considerations that go into Test B. And that's the work location in the contract of employment, the location the worker routinely attends during the term of employment to receive directions or collect materials and equipment, the location where the worker reports in relation to the work, and the location from where the worker's wages are paid.
So if test A, where they usually work, can't be satisfied, and it's unclear where they're usually based for that employment, then we move on to test C, which is the employer's principal place of business. On the face of it, this one sounds pretty clear. It's the principal place of business in Australia, but it can get a little bit murky because principal place of business doesn't just mean where it's registered. It's where the employer conducts the main part or the majority of its business. Some considerations can be where they're registered on the ABR or the ASIC National Names Index. It could be their business mailing address, but it's going to be looked at kind of a little bit more deeply where it's done or where the insured does the main part of their business. So if test A, where the worker usually works, can't be satisfied because they might work interstate, and test B, where they're usually based for that employment, can't be satisfied, then we look at the employer's circumstances and where their principal place of business is. So some considerations from the Knight case, which was out in WA, just drilling that in. The most important or main place where it conducts the main part or majority of its business, and it's not necessarily the same as its principal place of business that's registered with ASIC. Usually is, but not always. Okay. All right. This one.
So test D, it's kind of like you've gone through test A to C. Test D is kind of, it's a bit of a niche kind of test that applies to workers on ships. So I'll just quickly touch on it. But a ship is basically any vessel used in navigation by water, as we would often consider a ship to be. And it's considered in the Seafarers Rehabilitation and Compensation Act 1992. If a worker works on a ship and no single state or territory is identified in test A, B, or C, then we look at where the vessel's registered. There are circumstances where the vessel's registered in more than one jurisdiction, and in that instance, the state of connection is a state or territory in which the ship's most recently become registered. Again, a pretty unusual set of circumstances. I personally haven't come across it in my time doing this. Not to say it doesn't happen, but I'm sure it's probably not applicable to 99% of people on this call.
So test A, we don't know. Test B, it's unclear. Test C and D, again, up in the air. Then we look at where did the injury actually happen. So a worker's employment will be considered for the other tests, provided there's no place outside Australia under the legislation for which a worker can be entitled to compensation. Then we look at where the injury actually happened and which state. For disease injuries, that can be a little bit difficult to determine when the disease manifests itself, and there are cost sharing implications or cost sharing arrangements for interstate employment that has contributed to a disease. But if we have sort of a frank injury, someone falls over or someone is unfortunately injured, and the majority of those will just look at where the injury happened. So this one is what you would imagine would be where they would be insured, but this is kind of the final test.
So at least you'll get your answer at least by test A.
Yes.
So temporary arrangements. So a worker can work for the same employer for up to 6 months without needing to reconsider where they usually work. But after 6 months, the employer needs to review their insurance arrangements relating to a worker. So, for example, you could have a worker that typically works from home and wants to go check out, Noosa or something like that up the Queensland coast. Typically works from New South Wales. There might be a temporary arrangement where they agree, listen, go work up in Queensland. It'll be less than 6 months. It's going to be a temporary arrangement. In that instance, you probably won't need to take out a further policy in Queensland. It's just important to keep records supporting that it remains a temporary arrangement, particularly if there's like an extension of time. So say after 6 months, there might be family circumstances or something like that. And they say, no, I need another 3 months up here. It's important to file note those discussions, keep them on their personnel file, whatever it might be. You might want to include it as part of a term of the contract, just to make sure that it's well established that it's a temporary arrangement. And there's something you can really turn to should an issue like this arise. Conversely, if that particular person decides, actually, no, I want to stay up here long term, I love it up here, the parties can agree after 6 months that there's a new state of connection. And in that case, the employer should take out new coverage, in this instance, up in Queensland. It's important to draw a distinction between short-term employment and a temporary arrangement. So a temporary arrangement is between a worker and an employer during a longer continuous period of employment. But if someone is employed short-term and exclusively in one state, there would likely be a state of connection, even if it's less than 6 months. So basically, the intention is to allow workers to be located elsewhere, give them a bit of flexibility, short term, without the employee needing to take out a separate policy.
So that ties in pretty well with Hux's example of Bob the Builder.
Yeah, how does this apply to Bob, my mate?
Yeah,
I've got to talk to him after the session. Yeah.
So Bob and his team that have got that project up in Queensland, that's likely to be a temporary arrangement because they're going to be up there for less than 6 months. The intention is that it's a temporary arrangement. So they would only need the New South Wales coverage that I imagine they've already got. The distinction, though, is if he realizes when he's up there that he needs some additional staff and he hires people to help out with that project that's going to be exclusively up in Queensland, he'll need Queensland coverage for those workers because that's not a temporary arrangement. They're employed to work in Queensland. So their usual place of work will be Queensland with this employer. They don't have a connection to New South Wales. And so that's if we tie it all back in, the intention of the legislation was to reduce the burden on employers. So we've got two groups of workers there. We've got to look at them separately because their contracts are different. The permanent employees, their usual place of business is New South Wales. They've just got a temporary arrangement there. Again, as Sean touched on, though, it's really important to maintain records of that, records that the intention was that this is a temporary arrangement, particularly if the project runs over that sort of 6 month mark.
Cool. All right. Thanks, guys.
Let Bob know.
I'll let him know. Yeah, I'm going to catch him for coffee after.
All right, so we've got another case here that kind of helps to illustrate the point. This was back in 2021. We had a worker who sustained an injury to a lower back and shoulders. She was based up in Queensland, but she travelled to Melbourne and to New South Wales for work. She hadn't spent much time down there, but she had travelled, I think it was part of she was selling holiday packages at shopping centres, and so she was required to travel for that. She brought a claim under the New South Wales Act. I'm not entirely sure why. I presume it was a little bit more favourable to her circumstances. And so because the insured was uninsured in New South Wales, it was brought against the nominal insurer. So there is that sort of catch-all provision for uninsured employers. The worker is covered, but then the nominal insurer may go after the employer for recovery of claims costs. So the claim was brought against the employer and the nominal insurer on the basis that the employer was uninsured in New South Wales. As mentioned, the first respondent, so her employer, was registered in Queensland and they had a policy there. The worker had commenced employment in March of 2021. She relocated to the Gold Coast where the employer was based, but she did have to travel to Victoria and New South Wales for her work. The injury occurred in Sydney, I think it was in Blacktown actually, and she contended that she would have continued to work in New South Wales and there was evidence of her plans to move there. She wanted to come back to New South Wales, so she felt that she should be covered by the New South Wales Act. If we go to the next slide. So it was agreed that the fact that a worker is outside of a state when injury happens, it's not a bar to compensation. The onus is on the worker seeking benefits to establish that their employment is connected to the New South Wales. And the test of the legislation sets out how to determine this. She was not entitled to compensation under the New South Wales Act just because the injury happened in New South Wales. She'd spent very little time in New South Wales. I think it was 6 days or so. She contended that she was intending to move to New South Wales, but that was not enough to establish that she was usually working in New South Wales or based in New South Wales. The evidence was that at the time of the injury, she was in Sydney temporarily. She had just travelled here to sell holiday packages. The majority of her work, or almost exclusively her work, was in Queensland. And it was relevant to look at the fact that there was no sort of direction from her employer that she should find permanent accommodation or permanent premises in Sydney. It's not like they were setting up sort of a New South Wales office or a New South Wales branch or division. So it couldn't be concluded that the intention of the parties was that she would usually work in New South Wales.
So it's very much just like a one-off kind of
it was a one-off thing
situation where she would pop down to Queensland, try and sell some product, but typically speaking, should be based up in Queensland.
Yeah. So test A, she would usually be in Queensland. If not, and it was kind of murky if she traveled more regularly, if we go to test B where she's usually based, she collected all of her materials and she took all of her direction from the Queensland office. So test B would sort of set her state of connection to be Queensland. So again, she was covered by the Queensland Act in that instance. This one's a little bit different. This is Pioneer Concrete and the nominal insurer. The employer had a concrete pumping business with a depot in Queanbeyan. He employed his brother at the time, and most, if not all of their work was actually in the ACT. So they only held a policy in the ACT. The worker was injured when he lifted a petrol can at the New South Wales depot where they started the day in Queanbeyan, and the nominal insurer paid the claim but sought reimbursement from the employer. So the only consideration, there was no dispute about injury, the only consideration was the state of connection for the worker's employment. So he was employed as a concrete pump operator. He'd worked there since 2018. The injury happened in 2021, I believe. And his duties were arranged so he did not have to do heavy work to accommodate a prior injury that he'd sustained. The worker worked out of the Queanbeyan depot. He lived nearby with his brother, who was also the director of the employer. And every morning they would go to the Queanbeyan depot, they would fuel up the trucks, and then they'll drive to job sites, usually in the ACT and Canberra area, before they return to the depot at the end of the day. The worker's main duties were to operate the controls of the concrete pump, and injury occurred when he was lifting a 20-kilogram fuel can at the depot in Queanbeyan. So if we go to the next slide. The worker and the employer contended that the majority of his work was in the ACT, where they held a policy, and it wasn't disputed that they did very little work in New South Wales. It was about an 80-20 split, that they spent 80% of their time in the ACT, almost all of their work was there, and they spent very little time at the Queanbeyan depot. But they did work in New South Wales, so there was no clear answer for test A where they usually worked. Because this isn't a mathematical exercise. It's just, do you regularly or have to regularly work between states? So we moved on to the next test, which is where the worker is usually based. The Commission noted that the worker commenced and ended work every day at the Queanbeyan depot. He collected the truck and materials in New South Wales. However, it was accepted that the worker often took direction from the employer at various job sites in the ACT, where he did the majority of his work. So test A, test B may not be able to be satisfied. We moved on to test C, which is the employer's principal place of business. So on to the next slide. The principal place of business was clearly the Queanbeyan Depot in New South Wales. The trucks were parked there every evening. The equipment was stored there. The office was held there, and the administration was run from there. The depot was listed as the employer's premises, and the fact that the work was done at ACT sites did not mean that that was the insured's principal place of business. So the state of connection was New South Wales, and unfortunately in this matter, the employer wasn't insured there. Okay. So, hypotheticals.
Hypotheticals. Again, this is a rather niche example, but it does pop up time to time. So we've got a farmer that has a property on the New South Wales-Queensland border. The homestead's on the New South Wales side, and the farmhands work across the property, so across border, and one of them unfortunately suffers an injury. As I said, the farmhands do not usually work in New South Wales or Queensland, so test A cannot be established. They work across the border, regardless of that time split, as Shiraz said. So we move on to the next test, where the worker is usually based. In this hypothetical, the farmhands report to the homestead, so the answer to where they are based is New South Wales. The homestead's on the New South Wales side. If this was not the case or it was unclear, I don't know, I suppose if the homestead was smack bang on the border, the homestead in New South Wales will still be the principal place of business. So I suppose it'd be, I don't know, a 70-30 split across border or something like that.
All right, moving on to the next one. This happens a little bit more regularly in our experience. So if you've got someone who's employed to conduct sales or regularly travel between Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and the balance of their time, they work from home in Newcastle, and they take direction from a head office, perhaps based in Sydney. Test A can't be satisfied because they do regularly work in various states. We move on to test B, which is where the worker is usually based for that employment. That would be in Newcastle, and so they should be covered by New South Wales legislation. If it wasn't Newcastle, it would be the employer's principal place of business, which is Sydney, again, covered by the New South Wales legislation. Okay.
All right. So what we're going to do now, sorry, guys.
No,
Go on.
No, please.
No. I thought you were about to say something, Shiraz. We're going to move on to sort of wrap it up and get into a bit of Q&A. We've got a few questions starting to come through on those on the chat. Before we do that, I'll just jump in and I'll just give you an idea of what else we've got coming up from the mobile engagement team here. And on the screen, we've got a number of face-to-face events, including in 2 weeks' time, we'll be on the Central Coast running a small business breakfast. Then we'll be up the coast around Port Macquarie and Coffs Harbour in mid-September, running a minimising the impact of complex injuries sort of face-to-face session. That'll go for half a morning type thing. We have a session coming up in Southwest Sydney with a bit more information to be advised. We're going to send you a link with more information just for those as well. Another small business breakfast up in Ballina, and then towards the end of the year in October, we're going to run a mental health forum in the Sydney CBD. So what we'll do now, before I sort of obtain feedback on the session, we might just have a look at some of these questions. Is that okay with you guys? There's a few sort of
Absolutely.
coming through. I'll just scroll back up. I know I'd asked people to hold your questions for now, but the first question that came in was around the usual place of work. I don't know if you saw that one. What if it's a 50-50 split between ACT and New South Wales? How do we define usual?
Well, again, it's not a mathematical exercise, but if you do regularly work between the ACT and New South Wales, test A may not be able to be satisfied. So we move on to test B, which is where the worker is usually based for that employment. So if they start and end their work days, perhaps in New South Wales, like with that Queanbeyan case, then that would likely be the state of connection. If not, then we move on to test C. So the usual place of work can't always determine the state of connection in a particular matter, particularly if there's a 50-50 split of time, you'd have to move on to test B. That's the whole point of that cascading test. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I think the question was asked. We're talking about test day at the time, so then we've sort of covered that through the
Absolutely.
presentation there. So, look, actually, a question I had about working from home, and I know, like on the back of COVID, many people maybe have relocated, and we've kind of covered this in the session as well. You talk about the Gold Coast or other places people may have moved to, but for those employers who've had staff relocate to work from home interstate, I mean, how do we treat them?
Yeah, it's a really difficult, it's a case by case thing. Again, if they are usually, or if they exclusively work from home and that's interstate, that's their usual place of work in all likelihood. If they travel interstate because they might be on the border, or there might be an expectation that, you know, they work from home a large part of the time, but they're in the office and they're happy to do that, test A again may not be able to be satisfied. And we move on to test B, which is where they're based for that employment. It depends on the circumstances of the matter, but if they're taking direction and they're based and all their admin's done from home, that could be their state of connection. So it does get a little bit tricky, and you have to look at the individual circumstances of each matter, like the breakup of sort of where they do the majority of their time, where they're based for that employment, and of course what their actual role is.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at the subjective circumstances of the individual employee. So, as I said earlier, if you've got an example of an employee that's typically been based in New South Wales, but then moves up to Queensland, and it might be for family reasons or something like that. The arrangement was initially just for 6 months, a temporary arrangement. You want to keep all that, you want to get all that in writing, put it on the personnel file, say, listen, they're just up there for 5 months or 6 months. They've got family issues or family things going on up there, but the intention is they'll return to New South Wales. They'll be covered on the New South Wales policy. But if they decide when they're up in Queensland, hang on, I might actually hang around up here. I really like it up here. The beaches are great, whatever it might be. Love spending time with family. And they extend beyond 6 months and they say, no, I'm going to stay up here permanently. Then you'll need to look at taking out a policy in Queensland because they become a permanent employee, so to speak, up in Queensland.
Yeah, cool. And look, before I ask the next question, I'll just remind everyone, there was some messages about recording. I think the recording is still going. It looks like it's going at my end, but we are going to send it out in a couple of weeks. After the session today, we will send out also copies of the slide pack and some other useful resources which can help us with this matter. But question here about that Pioneer Concrete, actually, that Pioneer Concrete example. Could the employer seek recovery from the ACT workers' comp up to the limits applied in the ACT?
Oh, look, potentially, but I think the claim was brought. It was a claim brought by the nominal insurer against the employer because they paid the cost of the claim here, and so they were basically saying you're uninsured here and should have been. So that was an unfortunate circumstance for that employer. Yeah. So look, there's potential for that. I'm not sure if that was something that was ever looked at by the employer or the nominal insurer. But yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's just one of those, like it's just a typical example where you've got to really take a detailed look at state of connection when there's multiple different or potentially multiple different states that could be housing any particular worker, because you don't want to find yourself in a situation like the employer did there, where turns out that that particular employee's state of connection was in New South Wales, but there was no policy cover in that. Because as Shiraz said, then the nominal insurer can come after you and seek reimbursement for claims costs.
Yeah.
One thing we often encourage to employers when we're talking to them who may be crossing state boundaries or not really sure what to do is we often say, have a chat to the authority in the jurisdiction you're traveling to, but also you might want to take out what's known as a just-in-case type policy, a minimum premium type policy, so you do have some coverage in case something happens. And that's normally the equivalent of just a couple $100 or a bit of security, just in case something happens whilst interstate. So, yeah, all right. Now we've got something here. What have we got here? A few questions here.
Yeah. So
work from home arrangements. You go.
Yeah. So work from home arrangements. There was one there where the insured has no offices and employees work exclusively from home. Test A, where do they usually work, would be their home. So you'd want them to be covered there and to have insurance in that state where they work. That's a relatively clear-cut one. I saw another one for the truckers that have to travel interstate.
Yes.
Test A couldn't be satisfied if they're regularly traveling, across the border. You'd go to Test B, which is where they're based for that employment. If that could be satisfied, like they start and end their day, in a particular depot, then it makes it pretty clear. If not, then we go to Test C, which is the employer's principal place of business. So it's all about that cascading test, and it depends in each case. The circumstances are different for everyone's employment. Everyone's business is kind of structured differently, but you go to Test A, Test B, Test C. On the off chance you have to deal with Test D and then Test D.
Yeah. Another one here about an employee that relocated post-COVID. They were hired in this state, New South Wales, became 100% remote post-COVID. They now travel, I think, equally between New South Victoria and South Australia. Okay, maybe a little more in South Australia. The contract letter has the work location is New South Wales, but the employment record is South Australia as a new residence.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's not a temporary arrangement. Their working circumstances have changed.
Yep.
They travel between New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. A little bit more time in South Australia. Again, it's not a mathematical exercise, so we really couldn't deal with Test A. They usually work across the states. We go to Test B, where they're usually based from that employment. If they're working exclusively from home, again, we couldn't really satisfy that because they're traveling interstate. So we go to Test C, which is the employer's principal place of business. One thing I would say in this instance is you'd really want sort of detailed records of where they're spending their time if you can, because if it can be established that their usual place of work is now going forward going to be New South Wales or South Australia, or whatever the case may be, they've kind of permanently relocated there, you'd want to make sure that you've got coverage there.
Yeah, as Huck said, might be a couple of $100 a year to take out
just in case.
Coverage in South Australia if you've got one remote employee working out of there.
The old just in case policy. Look, we've got lots of questions about the whole working from home arrangements. I think we've sort of covered that a fair bit without going into everyone's detail. We do always suggest, if you're not sure, I mean, while we are answering a few questions here today, there's a lot of individual circumstances that do need to be considered. So we ask you, we recommend that you maybe contact iCare underwriting team or the state that maybe your staff are working in, just to be sure. Now, one here, we have many workers in Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, Western Australia working in different states. We usually register them with the state of residence. Does it mean if they come to Victoria and injure themselves, they're not covered? Sounds like a temporary, yeah.
It depends. Are they usually coming to Victoria for work? Is that their usual place for work? That's Test A. So where do they usually work? Are they regularly required to travel? If that's not the case, then we go to Test B, which is if they usually work from home and they've just kind of had to come into the office once, but they're not expected to. They're not sort of carrying on work interstate regularly. Test A would usually mean that, their work from home location is their state of connection. So that's how we would likely deal with that one.
Another one here in the Victorian border of New South, business registered to an accountant's office in Victoria. Directors of the business reside in New South Wales. They live on the border, do 80% of their work in Victoria.
Yeah. So where that's down the list. What we first look at is the workers, where they do their work. So what's their usual place of work where the business is done? If that's interstate, or if it's in New South Wales where they carry on all of the work, that would likely be the state of connection. It's not just where the business is registered. That's Test C, maybe. So Test A, where are the workers, the person who's unfortunately injured, where do they carry on their work? If it's unclear or they regularly travel between New South Wales and Victoria, then we go to Test B, where they're usually based. Test C goes to the business itself.
One here, they've got policies in both New South Wales and Victoria, but most work is in New South Wales, and they want to cancel the Victorian policy. So we can't talk to what happens in Victoria here, Helen, I'm sorry, but have a chat to, is it WorkSafe Victoria? You've got a policy in New South Wales currently, so yes, you can just increase the wages component in that policy. That's not a problem from our perspective, but whatever you do in Victoria, you'll need to talk to WorkSafe Victoria there. Have you guys spotted any more we can quickly run through?
Let's see.
A lot of working from home.
Yeah.
So it's a good question here, actually. Are the tests applied similarly in all states under the various state-based legislations?
Yeah, the intention was to simplify things, and I know that may sound silly now because it's quite complicated, but there's similar legislation, and the tests are applied. I mean, some of the cases we ran through were WA cases. It's relatively uniform across, because again, the intention is to reduce the burden on employers.
Cool. There's a good one here actually about an overseas worker, and we do get this a little bit, although it's just dropped off my screen. Where did it go? I think it was a worker was employed in New South Wales. I got a worker going overseas for a temporary period. Well, I've just lost it, sorry.
Okay, that's an interesting question. So again, if they're expected to go interstate or overseas, and it is a temporary arrangement, so less than 6 months, the intention of the parties is that they'll return and carry on their usual place of work in New South Wales, then it's likely to remain their state of connection. If the intention is unclear or they're looking at relocating, that's when you've got to look at, do we need to take out fresh coverage for them? And if it goes beyond that 6-month period, you really want to have kind of written records or written agreement between the parties about what the intention is going forward, because you don't want a situation where they travel interstate, they love it, and they might not come back and you don't have coverage over there.
Yep. Yeah, there's a few questions about overseas workers, so that comes up. Another one here. Work between New South Wales and Queensland doing jobs between 2 to 4 weeks. Sorry, 2 weeks to 6 months.
So it's important to know if you've got an employee based out of New South Wales and they travel overseas for like a work trip or something like that, in most instances, that'll be considered one episode of work, that work trip. So if they're flown over somewhere for a conference to Vegas or whatever for a conference, and they sustain an injury while they're over in Vegas, they're told to go there by the employer, and to be good for the business if you attend in Vegas, that'll be considered one kind of larger episode of work and will still be compensable under the New South Wales scheme.
Here's a really good one, actually. If working interstate just temporarily, so they're going interstate for 24 hours, are they covered the whole time they're there or only during the work hours?
Oh, no, you'd be covered. You'd be covered. So if your employer expects you, or there's a requirement, as Sean said, you're going to a conference or something like that, then unless you've done something to take yourself out of the course of employment, you would, in all likelihood, be covered. Is that your understanding? Yeah.
Yeah, that's my understanding too.
Yeah, one episode of work. It's just like one large overall episode of work. That 24 hours.
Very good. I don't know what else you got here. Aircrafts, international routes.
Not too many people talking about ships.
No, we've got planes, but no boats.
Yeah.
So we can cover off generally the people who travel globally. So if Test A can't establish their state of connection because they usually work interstate or overseas, we go to Test B, which is where they're usually based. Are they usually based in New South Wales? If that can't be answered, then we go to Test C. So it's all about that cascading test, and it's going to be different in every individual circumstance.
Yep. Very good. And there's one here with a business is being sold off to someone who's relocated to the Gold Coast. Do we still need to cover them? I think that's the gist of what I'm reading. And I'd say no. Look, a new owner of part of your business has been sold. It's up to them to, I suppose, establish a new workers' compensation policy. And it looks like they've relocated into Queensland as well. So suggesting, based on the limited information, it's probably going to be a Queensland policy that's required in this instance. Okay, a lot of the same sort of bits and pieces coming through. Interstate truck drivers, mentioned them before.
If your
Sorry,
normal
guys.
business is in New South Wales and you have a temporary contract for workers in Queensland, an employee decides to move to Queensland whilst on that contract, then my understanding is that the worker would be classed as a Queensland worker. Yes, if they're relocating up there, they're going to be working up there. You'd need coverage for them up there.
It's gone from being a temporary arrangement to a more permanent kind of
That would be the
arrangement. So you'd want
Yes.
to take out a policy up in Queensland.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. There was some question about the webinar series. Was only 2 in the series, guys. So the previous one is actually available on our webpage. You're going to get a link to our webpage so we can access that. Is there anything else that we want to grab, guys? There's lots of complicated, long questions which we can't get to. And we will encourage you to contact the iCare underwriting team just so they can sort of go through and work out what you should be doing as an employer to make sure you have got the right coverage in place. Anything else you can see that we want to touch on?
They're coming in thick and fast.
They're thick and fast, and it's hard to get to them. Okay, all right. Get to them. Okay, all right. What we might do then, we might start to wrap it up. So what I want to do, we just want to get some got to get your understanding of what you thought of the session here today. I just want your feedback. I'm just going to load a really quick poll here between 1 and 5. I'm just trying to get it to load. Now, on a scale of 1 to 5, what did you think? It's on the screen there, actually. What did you think of today's session here? And if you thought it was worthwhile, you'd like to see more of these sessions down the track, get the guys back from Turks, the good presenters, they certainly know their stuff. You'd give it a 4 or a 5. If it was the so-so session, you'd give it a 3. If it was no good, you'd give it a 1 or a 2. But we just want to get your feedback because this helps us determine what people would like to see as well in the future. Please put your comments in the chat box. We've got lots of questions there and we're almost on time. We're not going to get to all those questions there. We will encourage people to contact the various authorities in the various states or jurisdictions that you are working in. So before we wrap up, guys, is there anything else there that you can see that we can quickly respond to?
Let's have a quick look. All right. All right, I have a client who hired a contractor through a talent agency for a one-off job. After invoice has been paid, it was based in Queensland. Displayed. Oh, we've lost it. Where's it gone?
It's jumping around, isn't it?
Yeah, it's jumping around.
Oh, no, we can't get it back.
If it was through labour hire, look, I don't know, I didn't see the question, but if we are hiring someone on a contract through a labour hire company, just got to make sure that labour hire company has a policy, in place to cover them. I don't know if that's a interstate sort of question or more of a general contractor.
Right. Yeah. All right. So if we need workers' comp and ACT for businesses, head office is in Melbourne, workers in New South Wales. So again, test A goes to the individual workers. What is their usual place of work? Once an injury occurs, that's the first thing that will be looked at is that workers' circumstances. If that doesn't sort of determine the state of connection, then we go to where they're usually based for that work. It's test C, this is the third one. If we can't answer test A or test B, then we look at the employer itself and where their principal place of business is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Very good. All right. Guys, thank you again for joining me. It was a great session. I think hopefully we've simplified some of the more complicated sort of areas around workers' comp. It isn't always black and white, as we know. Bit of information here, the guys from Turks, to wrap it up. This is where they're based, sort of up the East Coast there, and we're actually going to get the slide pack with their details there. So if you need to contact them moving forward. But look, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There are dozens of questions coming through here, but look, we always encourage you to contact our underwriting team if required, or contact the various authority in the states that you are or will be working in. You will get a copy of the slide pack, and we will be sending out some links to other resources to hopefully support you with your questions. Until then, thanks for joining me, Shiraz and Sean. And yeah, hopefully we can run another session in the near future. So on that note, I might pop that music back on while people put in their sort of comments and questions, and we'll go from there.
All right.
Thanks
for having
everyone.
us, everyone.
No
Thanks
worries.
for having us, Ox.
All
Thanks for
right.
having you guys.
Awesome
Cheers.
session. Thanks, guys.